Hello, and thank you for listening to this podcast of the National Civic League. In celebration of the League's 125th anniversary, we've been interviewing descendants of our founders as well as important figures in the organization's history. Today, Secretary of the National Civic League's Board of Directors, Angela Romans, will be interviewing Honorable Henry Cisneros, Principal of Siebert, Cisneros, and Shank. Mr. Cisneros is also the former mayor of San Antonio, former secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as a former board chair of the National Civic League. Thank you both for joining us today. I look forward to your conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you so much, Secretary Cisneros. I'm excited about the conversation.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm a big fan of the National Civic League and look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Well, I will jump in where you started in terms of your public civic role. We have heard from some cities, especially smaller ones, that they're having a difficult time getting people to run for local office. What made you become or want to become a city council member and then a mayor in terms of your local office?
Well, I had an experience in college to be sent to a conference as a delegate to a conference at West Point. I was at Texas A&M at the time in the Corps of Cadets, and it was an opportunity to attend this conference on national affairs at West Point. But the very wise leader of the student union at Texas A&M said, "I want you to go and be our delegate, but I want a week from you to put you into New York City to meet people who I will get appointments for you with, but who will open your horizons to where we are in America and the options for you in terms of life and career." This is 1967. Literally, the cities were burning in some parts of the country. The civil rights movement was nearing its pinnacle of activity, and the Vietnam War protests were raging. The country was more angry than we are at the moment, if that's possible. But I would argue that the 67-68 time frame was as near as we have come to civil war since maybe the Depression, when we had people in camps, for example, that were unemployed, or the Civil War itself. In any event, I had the opportunity at that moment to see John Lindsay, the then mayor of New York, walking the streets of the city, trying to keep the city from burning, calm the city, respond with creative public urban responses, city responses, and it just became crystal clear to me that my instinct to want to do something of service, which I thought probably would mean the military, civil service, foreign service, something of that nature, could be done in an even more fulfilling way at the city level. So from that moment forward, most of my academic program, extracurricular activities, internships, first jobs, everything was built around becoming as expert on cities as I possibly could. I eventually did a master's degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard and a doctoral program at George Washington University, finished my doctorate in urban public administration. But I really thought I'd be more of a city administrator. I decided to accept a position at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and it was clear that in those days, it was very difficult to step into what might become a city manager kind of role as a minority. There were no African American, no Latino city managers in those days. And one day, my students at the University of Texas came up to me and said, "We need what you believe, what you teach, what you're talking about on the city council." I had never thought about running for public office. I really wanted to be more of administrator, manager, leader, but I decided to run for the city council. And the things I found were so stunning in terms of the unfairness and the waste and the inadequacy of helping people that I became a kind of a populist figure in town, and 6 years later was elected mayor. So that's the long story and the long background that tells you how I became a city council member.
Well, that is great, great set of stories. And so, we know, obviously, that you served as mayor of San Antonio for 8 years, and
Correct.
San Antonio has actually won the All-America City Award on multiple occasions from the National Civic League. So just thinking about your time in San Antonio and now, what about the city makes it an All-America city in terms of its civic sector and the civic engagement that happens, maybe compared to other cities?
It's an interesting amalgam of factors. Let me just say, when I was on the city council, I literally came to know the city very well, and when I became mayor, it's fair to say I fell in love with the city. I regard San Antonio now as a member of my family. That's how attached I am to this city. And it's as if it was my son or my daughter's welfare at stake, if you will, when I think about the things we want to do for this city. I'm very proud. I had known of the National Civic League through the years that I was in training in school, doing internships in Washington. I was a White House fellow. I worked at the National League of Cities, and I became familiar with the All-America City program. That was the sort of the branding, the hallmark of the National Civic League in those days. So I encouraged San Antonio to participate, and we won it on my watch. Actually, we went to the White House, and President Reagan gave the award. It was quite an uplifting thing for a city that was suffering through a crisis of confidence, that had a kind of an inferiority complex, that was at each other's throats, and we needed everything we could possibly put together to unify people, bring people together. So out of the experience with the All-America City program came an effort we called Target 90. This was 1983-ish or so that we started the process of bringing the city together around common goals. We created a dozen or so tri-party commissions. When I say tri-party, I mean African American, Latino, and traditional Texans working together, heading task forces to work on every aspect of the city's future. And sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, because I could not have foreseen the future results of that level of collaboration. And the result has been, simply put, that spirit of collaboration, which started with those efforts, has carried on now for 40 years or so. And virtually every mayor that we've had has been a person in the same kind of central current of thinking, central current of belief. And San Antonio went over that span, and I'm not claiming any personal credit because it was the doing of the people themselves, went from a city that was literally at each other's throats, impossible to forge any solutions without shouting and contention and threats and boycotts and protests, etc., to a city that today I believe is one of the more cohesive. If we were to pick all of the aspects of San Antonio that make it attractive, and there are many, from physical things like the Riverwalk to the culture of Latinos and Texans together with food and music and all kinds of things, its attractiveness as a place to raise children, very family-oriented. Of all of its attractive attributes, the one that I think has served us best and that gets the most attention is the collaborative form of decision-making and cooperation and consultation that governs our decisions in San Antonio. And a lot of that is perfectly in the spirit of the ideas that the National Civic League has identified as the best hopes for local progress over the years.
Wow, that's exciting. That's exciting. So the next question, this is where I start to turn into a sort of fangirl. You focused a lot of your professional life on the issue of fair housing and affordable housing. And I was actually just out of college when you became Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I remember it being so significant having a person of color in that role in the federal government, and what that meant for, for the Clinton administration, and just what it meant for the country in general. So that's my fangirl moment. But speaking of housing, why have you chosen to focus on housing? Why has that been such an issue for you in your career?
Well, it's an interesting, first of all, let me just say you make me feel old, learning that I became Secretary of Housing when you were still in school. But the truth of the matter is that my focus during the years I was mayor in San Antonio was principally upon economic development, because San Antonio was a very poor city. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, the Peace Corps used to send its volunteers to San Antonio to prepare themselves for the third world conditions they would encounter in other places in the world. So we were very obviously poor and very ethnically divided. So my job, as I saw it, and what I had learned at Harvard and MIT and other places, was the role of creating jobs, of expanding the economy, of creating an engine of economic progress. And those were the themes that I focused on. Housing was a part of that, but frankly, not a big part in my thinking, because you can only choose to do so many things. We did do some creative things in the housing field, like set up a housing trust fund and other things. But my real epiphany in housing was when President Clinton asked me to be his outreach to the cities and the mayors of the country by being the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Now, the day that I was nominated, and before the Senate for nomination hearing, a wise person, an old friend from my League of Cities days, came up and whispered in my ear as the hearing was ending. Now, remember, he said, that the secretary, who is the head of the department, whose name begins with housing, has to first take care of those Americans who are completely unhoused, the homeless, and others who are without decent, fair, affordable housing. And that was very clear to me. It stuck with me, and we worked very hard on homelessness. We worked very hard on affordability. I traveled to 200 different American cities on the job in every single one of the 50 states, and really, immersed myself in housing. And it became very clear to me. As I say, I had epiphany moments when it was so clear that without dealing with the basic question, where am I going to put my children down to sleep tonight? Where are they going to rest their head on a pillow when darkness comes, when it's cold outside, when there's danger outside? Without addressing the question of housing, all of the other things we strive for as goals for a civilized society, education, better jobs, better health care, stable personal lives, all of those things, quality of life generally, cannot be addressed without the fundamental question, which becomes critical in every 24-hour cycle: where are we going to sleep? Where are we going to keep our possessions? Where are we going to eat? Where are we going to be safe? And that involves housing. And so I was so convinced coming out of HUD that the company that I created in 2000 was a housing company. I basically said, look, I can't solve everything in our society, but I can focus what I have learned in one area, which is we need more production of affordable and workforce housing. So even though I chose to do it in the private sector as opposed to go back into government, because I really wanted to do it for the long haul, and I didn't like the idea of having to make this work dependent upon election cycles or upon an enforced retirement, et cetera. I want to be doing this for the rest of my life. And we created a company that's now called CityView that's done probably 7,000 units of housing in 13 states, 100 projects, and been fairly disciplined about focusing on what we call workforce. It's not upscale expensive. It's not subsidized for the very poor, but it's what firemen and policemen and teachers and nurses and tech workers and governmental workers, average working families in cities need for housing. It's been a good endeavor. Now, in the subsequent years, my aperture has widened, and I have engaged in companies, either purchased or participated in their formation of companies that are heavily involved in municipal finance and in infrastructure, in addition to housing. So those are still the three focuses of my life: urban housing, municipal finance, giving the municipalities the resources to continue to build and progress, and more recently, explicit efforts to raise private capital and deploy it into airports, seaports, water systems, power systems, schools, broadband, et cetera. So that's what I started out to do as a result of that trip to New York way back in 1967, and what I'm still doing today, all these years later.
Wow. That's such a broad portfolio, and really exciting that the housing piece has stayed as a key pillar of that, because it's so critical. And I feel like it's not the issue that gets a lot of the sexy coverage, especially as you were talking about the sort of working professional housing for firefighters and police officers and teachers in that sector.
Today I am the local chair of the advisory committee to a group called LISC, which is one of the two national intermediaries, Enterprise and LISC. And so I want to make up for whatever time we lost during my watch as mayor in the housing arena by really giving back. My principal cause in San Antonio through LISC is housing production. We want to build more housing for seniors. We want to build more for homeless. We want to build transitional housing. We want to build permanent supportive housing, but we want to build a lot of housing. We have an immense shortfall in this city of housing, affordable housing, and not enough being produced.
Yeah. Now, this is a segue to talking about your most recent book, Building Equitable Cities in an Urban Nation, and I wonder if housing comes up in that book. Can you talk a little bit about what made you decide to write that book and some of the strategies that you focus on in the book?
Well, clearly housing does play a role in the strategies that will make cities more equitable. The book came about because I had done a previous research project for the Urban Land Institute, which focused on why this is a time that cities are developing economically so solidly, and we're seeing what in many places might be called an urban renaissance. I mean, that sounds strange considering all of the focus on urban problems, but New York is closing in on 9 million people, up from 8 million people, and entire neighborhoods like Brooklyn and the Bronx have been transformed. Other cities that were once losing population, today even their downtown areas are growing as concentrations of residential. Denver, for example, and Atlanta, for example, and Washington, D.C. has undergone major neighborhood. Los Angeles, the city where they once said there's no there's no center, now has a massive numbers of people living in the downtown. There's something really powerful happening, and it has to do with a whole series of factors like the new urban economy that is more urban-centered, the new American economy that is more urban-centered. It's more international trade, business services, new media, hospitality, et cetera. It has to do with the attitudes of local leaders to build up their density, and it has to do with demographics. The millennials want to live in exciting places, and the empty nesters want to come back to exciting places. And the demographics of the creation of a middle class out of people who have been discriminated and marginalized, but are now creating the next American middle class with a lot of work to be done, to be sure. But I mean, there's just ample cases, examples of cities across the country that are strengthening. So I wrote that book that sort of chronicled that, identified it, looked at the underlying dynamics, and then it became clear to me, because the debate about inequality had gotten so intense, income inequality and inequality generally a few years ago, that why don't we use this prosperity that's happening in our cities and harness it to work for more equitable results? Given that the federal government is having an almost kind of existential crisis, existential debate about what is its role, and we're seeing rollbacks in that traditional role of the federal government as the focal point for equity strategies, the last protection of people. Justice Department played that role in the Civil Rights Movement, for example, and many other cases since, enforcing fair housing, for example. Given the federal government is withdrawing from that arena, and given that state governments have never really taken equity as the principal logic for their oversight of the health systems or higher education, shouldn't it fall to cities that are the places where the demographic change in America is occurring? Shouldn't it fall to cities that now have some economic resources at work? Shouldn't it fall to cities where a lot of talent, creativity, and imagination is being unleashed in all kinds of arts and business startups and technology efforts and yes, governance, organizing strategies? Shouldn't it fall then to cities to intentionally pursue equity as an objective for why they exist, for why they are making decisions that they're making? In other words, transform the equity role of cities from just accidental, anecdotal, from the traditional staging areas they've been for immigrants, into something that has more intentionality to it. Let's figure out, what do we have to do to make 2 + 2 = 5? What's the secret ingredient that we need to input in order to make cities really the focal points of American equity? And I think it's happening. It's happening because we have a lot of smart people working in the field. It's happening because this is where people are demanding change. And it's happening because it's really possible. There's a lot of things within the power of cities, not just city municipal leaders, but city civic and community organizers to make happen. Better job training, better education in the public schools, all kinds of creative models of education that include magnet schools and charter schools, et cetera. All kinds of immigrant integration activities at the municipal and city level, welcoming to immigrants, sanctuary cities that are basically saying to ICE and immigrant enforcers, stay away. We know what we're doing here. Immigrants are a plus in our cities, et cetera. So you take all of that, and I think it has the potential, at least, to take us in the direction of more equitable places. Now, if we had a federal government that was positive and encouraging, if we had a series of state governments that said, we have resources to help by infusing energy into higher education that we run, the state colleges or the state health departments or the public school finance that we provide. Can you imagine what could happen on the platform of America's cities to make our country more equitable?
Well, I will try to imagine that, but since we don't unfortunately currently have that, I think that lead-in was a perfect segue to talking now about the role of the National Civic League and your involvement on that and our current work, and seeing what you think about the current work of the League. So you were chairperson of the board of directors of the National Civic League in the early 90s. And can you just talk a little bit about how you got involved in the League and what your interest was in the organization and what the National Civic League was focusing on when you were on the board?
Well, I got involved because John Parr and Chris came to see me in San Antonio on a Sunday afternoon. And I had just stepped down from being mayor, or maybe a year out from being mayor. And they came to see me and said, you know, you need to share some of what you did in San Antonio in a structural way where it can resonate and expand by being exposed to what people are doing in other places. And the right place for you to do this is at the National Civic League, and the right way for you to do it is to be chair of the National Civic League. So I decided, because of my experience with the All-America City program, that I would do it. And it was a very intellectually satisfying period for me, because I was exposed to people like Governor Winter at the state level from Mississippi, and many others from across the country who were working on these exact ideas, but all of us working under the rubric, under the general kind of overarching framework of civic engagement as the key to educating people, connecting them to their cities, to their communities, unleashing the best ideas, but doing it all kind of with a bottoms-up honoring the bottoms-up tradition of our society. That, to me, was the essence of what we mutually believed. And so we spent a lot of time over. I think I was chair for several years, and I know it was at least 2, and we focused on trying to identify the paths of transition whereby traditional American urban institutions would prepare themselves for this new era of civic engagement. And that meant, libraries transforming themselves from quiet places where you just went and checked out books to places that were meeting places for people to have meetings on citizenship and community planning, and police departments were more community oriented in their policing, and schools became focal points for parents to gather after hours, including putting public libraries in the schools. So the community would come into the schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we were working on, concrete ways that would take what the essence of the National Civic League's message had been over many years, in terms of the beauty that is civic, and the treasure that is civic engagement, the engine that is civic engagement, and help it find its way in a world that was increasingly high-tech, increasingly individualistic, increasingly skeptical of democratic small d processes, and that was our work. That was our work in that period. And I think we understood what was coming. I can't say that we were immensely successful in creating the antidote, because those trends were so powerful with technology and social media and kind of demographic change that spawned fears, and public leaders that opted for dividing, and all of those streams were so powerful that I think they swamped, the tendency toward civic engagement. But Lord knows this is something we need to continue to press. There is no other alternative. There is no other alternative. It is essential to the nation's future and well-being, to our continued development as a democratic society, and therefore the Civic League's role, the Civic League's place in the pantheon of nonprofit institutions remains, to me, quite clear.
Well, thank you. And I, as a board member, certainly feel like that continues to be our work, as challenging and important as it is, as you said. And so we are in our 125th year. The Civic League began in 1894. And, of course, as you know, around political reform and good governance, and has included, of course, civic engagement as our primary focus now. So the last question I have is, here in our 125th year, what advice do you have as the League celebrates that milestone, especially in this current political climate?
Well, essentially, my hope for the National Civic League is that it stays the course. There are ideals that are universal and eternal. They cut across all societies and nations across the world, and they span time. So the original idea of civic engagement, because we are human beings and social creatures, are continue to be valid, and they require us to keep them alive. That's what the National Civic League has done, and that job is all the more important today. So I would say, stay the course, continue to study the options, continue to adapt to the new realities, continue to raise voices, continue to be the keepers of the fire, if you will, the voices of certainty and conviction about these values, and find a way to, no matter how small that flame may get, keep it lit, because the country will need those ideas again, and they need to be constantly retaught and reaffirmed and reminded and repeated, because there is no other way to build the kind of society when people are involved and diversity is involved and mixed agendas are involved. Only by speaking together, only by collaborating, only by finding ways to reach consensus in civil ways will our country achieve its full potential.
Wow. Well, that was an inspiring note, I think, to end, and we'll take all of that advice to heart as we continue to stay the course. And so, Secretary Cisneros, it's been a joy for me, certainly, to interview. I thank you so much for this time, for your thoughtfulness, and for your service to this country.
Again, I'm sorry I was not able to be there. I'm sorry I was not able to be there in June, but I hope to be helpful to the National Civic League and its goals going forward.
Excellent. Angela and Secretary Cisneros, thank you both for your time today and for the great conversation. Really appreciate you joining us. For those of you listening in, you can find more interviews like this one on the League's website, nationalcivicleague.org, and on our social media accounts at National Civic League. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.